Okay, hello and welcome to MSDynamicsWorld.com's Fall 2013 BI webcast series. I'm Jason Gumpert, and joining us today we have Cristian Nicola of DynamicsBIGuide.com. Cristi is a returning presenter for us. We're really glad to have him back, and he will be presenting on the topic of self-service BI for Dynamics ERP with PowerPivot. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have a really great attendee group, and I think it's an indication of how quickly this technology is starting to capture the interest of the Dynamics community. So we're glad you can attend, and as we get started, I just want to add, we will welcome your questions and comments throughout the presentation. You can add your input here if you'd like through the chat and the Q&A blocks that you see to the right of the screen, and we will try to get to as many, Cristi will try to get to as many as he can throughout this hour-long presentation today. So without further delay, please allow me to welcome today's speaker, Cristian Nicola.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, everyone.
Hey, Cristi, do you happen to have a handset that you can use? You're sounding a little echoey right now.
Oh, okay. Is this better?
It is better.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, hi everyone. My name is, just mentioned, my name is Cristian Nicola. I am a Dynamics consultant as well as specializing on business intelligence, specifically for Microsoft Dynamics. As Jason mentioned, we will be covering today, I guess, a quick overview of the new self-service BI option from Microsoft called PowerPivot. I guess as a quick summary of what we will go through, we'll have a quick introduction and discuss what PowerPivot is. And once we go over that, we will try some actual hands-on exercises with PowerPivot. So we'll try reading data with PowerPivot, and then basically we will build our own PowerPivot reports and try a couple of advanced design examples. I mean, the topic itself, it's really vast, and we could probably spend an entire 2-3 days just simply covering everything that can be done with it. I will try to leave space at the end for some Q&A, but I mean, as Jason mentioned, feel free at any point in time to post your questions, and we'll try to answer them as soon as possible. I guess with further ado, we'll start the presentation. So just an introduction to PowerPivot. PowerPivot, I guess my motto for this is built by business users, managed by IT. So what is PowerPivot? It's a free add-on that is available in Excel 2010 and 2013. In Excel 2010, you actually have to go and download it from a Microsoft website. In 2013 is actually built into the product. Most of the time, for almost all the versions, there's only, I think if you buy it straight off the shelf from a store like Best Buy or something, that you might not have it available. But 2013 is basically deployed already with PowerPivot, as well as it's built into the Office 365, the cloud version of Office that Microsoft offers. The PowerPivot leverages familiar Excel features. It uses pivot tables, pivot charts, and it uses most of the Excel functions that you have grown to know and like, and also introduces some new functions specific to manipulating data within the framework of PowerPivot, but they also keep a similar Excel functions format to sort of maximize your familiarity with the product that you already have. Also, and this is part of the built by business users, managed by IT, I mean, PowerPivot is available both as personal BI. I mean, essentially you can build your reports with PowerPivot just simply using Excel on your desktop and connecting to whatever data sources you would like to report on. But you can also sort of make it a corporate BI by deploying the data models that you're building and the reports using SharePoint and SQL Server. So essentially, if it's personal BI, you will be just using it individually. SharePoint comes in, and with SQL Server, you can actually upload the data models, and then it allows for, I guess, a centralized control of the data models, hence the managed by IT part. And it also allows, obviously, through the features of SharePoint, a easier distribution to all people that may be interested in having access to those reports. Okay. I guess, you know, this is I guess illustration of where PowerPivot comes in and the problems that it's trying to solve. So I mean, essentially, there's always been people have always had the two options, or seem to be the only two options. Do we use Excel, or do we do real BI, which I call full BI? So, I mean, if you were to do, spreadsheets, I mean, basically people today, they always use spreadsheets. The problem with ongoing spreadsheets is maintenance, updates, highly labor-intensive, error-prone, and unsecure. I'm pretty sure everybody here that has worked with Dynamics at one point in time, or any other system, one point in time, they've done a copy and paste into Excel, and then started doing their own analysis and everything else. Which, I mean, obviously that's what PowerPivot is looking to try to leverage, your familiarity with that kind of Excel, as well as your, I guess, comfort level with dealing with the data and knowing where to get it and everything else. But I mean, at the end of the day, every time you have to start this, you have to do another copy and paste and everything else. So that was the problem with actual spreadsheets. In terms of real BI, centralized BI, full BI, I mean, essentially there are BI options, full service BI, all app cubes as they are known and everything. Usually the problem with that is you have high startup costs. Usually have to buy a product and you have to install it. It requires relatively rare specialized skills. I mean, essentially, to be able to customize it requires technical people. It requires people that know the full extent of the Microsoft stack. It requires probably a third-party product if you ended up buying one. Lead times over measured in months. I mean, essentially, this is a development process where you would have consultants trying to establish a certain specification, pass it on to the developers, and then you have the entire full development process that needs to go through. Many needs go on field. I mean, essentially at that point, everybody probably gets the ability of only specifying certain things, like every other thing, including in when you're doing ERPs. And every time you need to make an addition, that you need something else. I mean, you've maybe made a request and it's being delivered to you, and then you realize that you probably need a couple of other things, and now you have to go back to the same circle. So basically, what PowerPivot is trying to, sort of come in is basically it offers the low startup cost and agility of spreadsheets, essentially being able to start immediately. Use Excel so you can get results the same day, and most people know how to use that. And it's also blended with robustness and low ongoing cost of traditional BI, because basically behind the scenes, PowerPivot uses a technology that is relatively similar to what is actually done in full-blown BI in the OLAP technology. It's basically a very robust product, and it allows for easy control over the data access, as well as easy refresh of the data sources and everything else. So essentially, if you remember my motto about PowerPivot, created by business users, managed by IT, that's kind of where this comes in. You can sort of start it on your own without necessarily having the need to go to to a full-blown BI and waiting for technical people. But in the same time, IT can sort of contribute to this with providing the data sources necessary for you to do your reporting. From a technical perspective, what are the PowerPivot benefits? It has the ability to handle up to hundreds of millions of rows in a single workbook, while maintaining manageable file sizes and fast performance. So, I mean, obviously, this is part of the Microsoft, marketing, and I actually do know people that in real life scenarios they have managed to run this on hundreds of millions of rows at the high end of optimization and design. That can be done, but generally, I mean, the point here is that it can take a relatively high volume data and handle it properly. The data is actually stored, and that's the other thing, manageable file size. The data is actually stored. One thing you should know, it's stored within the actual spreadsheet. And there's a limitation of like 2 gigabytes for the size of the file, and I think that's a limitation related to the fact that you cannot upload to SharePoint a file bigger than that, because otherwise probably it could go even further. Pivot tables, it allows you to use pivot tables and pivot charts built over multiple tables without requiring those tables to be VLOOKUPed to get into a single table. So I mean, essentially, this takes away from the need to use VLOOKUP, as I'm sure many of you have taken a look at it. And then also allows you the capability to quickly create mashups that cross-reference and integrate data from multiple sources. You can bring, and we'll cover this, many different data sources into PowerPivot, into the scene, one single spreadsheet, and then sort of combine them together. And the new formula engine for pivot tables that goes far beyond any formula capabilities available in Excel to date. So Basically, PowerPivot comes along aside from the Excel functions that you're familiar with and all the cell functions that you have used before. It comes along with its own language called DAX, D-A-X, that allows basically for extra reporting abilities that were not available before in Excel. Okay, so I guess we'll talk quickly about reading data into PowerPivot. So generally speaking, basically the PowerPivot, as I mentioned before, it can accept a tremendous list of data sources. I mean, you can bring data from any SQL database. Pretty much, I think, if you use any ODBC connection, you could probably do it. Anything that you've been able to read data into Excel before, you could actually use it for PowerPivot as well. It supports web services and, even more important, OData web services that we'll discuss a little bit later. It can actually read from OLAP cubes, and I guess I forgot to put in there, it can actually read even from PowerPivot, from other PowerPivot tables. So basically, you can connect PowerPivot to an actual real BI to combine maybe some of that information with real live information from your system as well. It can also read from PowerPivot, as I said, PowerPivot data models if you deploy them onto the SQL Server 2012 and up. It can read from Excel spreadsheets and many more other data sources. Now, in terms of our specific domain, as you can see here, Dynamics NAV is at the top. My background is actually in Dynamics NAV in terms as an ERP consultant and developer. But I mean, in terms of business intelligence, it really doesn't make a difference which product we're using. So for NAV, the two options that we have is either sort of having direct access to SQL, either by basically reading SQL tables from NAVs. You can actually create SQL views if you want to do that, or SQL queries as well. So this is applicable to any NAV version that is running on SQL databases. Then also you can use OData web services that they are a feature available in NAV 2013, NAV 2013 R2 and up. Okay, we just got a question, so I guess I'll throw that in there. I did forget about Dynamics CRM. Yes, Dynamics CRM as well. Same thing. I mean, if you have an on-prem, if you have an on-premise CRM, then basically you're going to have the same SQL tables access. And also, as far as I know, CRM actually is able to expose its data through OData web services as well. So therefore, you would have the same options as Dynamics NAV. And I do apologize, I forgot about it. On the Dynamics AS, you have the same options, SQL tables, views, and queries, as well as the data web services. I mean, my knowledge here on AX is not necessarily that strong, but I think the data web services were available through the query object since AX 2009. So basically from that version upwards, I'm sure this is something that if you don't know, you can ask your partner or I guess someone in your organization that might know about it. But the advantage, I guess, and then Dynamics GP, honestly, I do not know whether they support the data web services right now. So you would have the same thing, SQL tables, views, and queries on any version running on the SQL databases. So basically, I mean, the reason the advantage of data web services versus direct SQL access is that, as far as I know, especially on the GP and the AX side, and I don't know necessarily on the CRM side, but I think CRM might be like the vision a little bit more friendly. The SQL tables and the names, I mean, first of all, Dynamics AX, for instance, I know that they don't really recommend you going back to the back end directly, and they recommend you to go through the AOT, and that's where the advantage of the OData web services come in, because through the query object and everything, it actually works through the AOT, so therefore it's a business level access rather than a hardcore level access. And I mean, also on the GP side, I understand that SQL tables, basically they're not user-friendly in terms of naming, and therefore, basically I think probably it would be preferable to have some kind of interface to it. So maybe the other way this could be handled is creating some views, let's say on the GP side, creating some views by your IT that sort of expose the data that is needed, and hopefully in a somewhat friendly, user-friendly environment. Okay. All right, so I mean, this is pretty much about the Dynamics products, and I guess we'll move on. This was basically the theory part, and I guess we can talk about it as much as we want, but probably, as I always like to say, a spreadsheet is worth 1,000 slides. So at this point, I would like to jump into the actual PowerPivot environment and sort of give you a taste for it. Before we do that, I guess, I mean, we had the Dynamics CRM question. Do we have any other questions at this point? Okay, so I guess we are okay for now. All right, so now we'll switch to my computer. Okay, Jason, can you see my screen? It's okay.
Yeah, we're seeing your screen now.
All right, thank you. All right, so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Office 2013 for most of the presentation. As I said, it's both 2010 and 2013. The slightly different versions. The interface looks slightly different from one to another, but essentially it's the exact same functions, just maybe spread around differently on the ribbon. The other thing that I wanted to point out is, I guess, as a recommendation, as you guys make a decision as to which one you want to use. Basically, as I mentioned, the data gets stored into the spreadsheet whenever the spreadsheet is closed and everything. But in terms of trying to do all the analysis, calculation of measures, slicing and dicing of data, everything is actually done in memory. So there's an engine, I think it's called Vertipack, that basically was developed for this, that runs all these analyses, as I said, similar to pretty much what analysis services on the SQL side does, but it does it all in memory. So basically here, one of the important things in terms of performance, depending on the amount of data you have, is actually, one, how much memory you have on your laptop, computer, server, wherever this thing is being deployed. And also the other thing that is recommended is basically that I would recommend is to actually install the 64-bit version of Office versus the 32-bit. Essentially because, as you know, that means it allows it to use more memory in a more efficient way. So, essentially, you could probably be able to handle more data in a 64-bit environment with less RAM than you would in a 32-bit environment with more RAM. Now, the only thing, and I'm still trying to see if I'll be able to get an answer from Microsoft. I think a lot of times, every time I've installed Office anywhere, I've tried not to install the 64-bit because it says if you install 64-bit, certain things may not work and whatever. And even if you look on some of the, I'll reference nav simply because that's what I know more. If you look at some of the nav blogs from Microsoft, they say, okay, this functionality is available, but certain things will not work with 64-bit. I haven't been able to figure out which ones they are. But if you're dedicated to trying to do this and trying to do this in a real-life environment, I strongly recommend going to 64-bit. For the purposes of the demo here, I will be using a demo in Dynamics NAV, but as I said, I will just show a SQL access and then I'll show data, which is what I will use throughout the rest of the presentation, simply because you'll see it's a lot nicer to use that. But it really is no different if you were on one of the other ones, CRM, AX, or GP. Okay, so basically when we go into Excel, as I mentioned, whether you install it in Office 2010 or whether basically you just get 2013, there will be a tab called PowerPivot. So what happens is PowerPivot will open up once you go there and you say Manage. It will actually open up a different screen. So now if you could see on my taskbar, I actually have Excel, and then I have the PowerPivot environment. So the PowerPivot environment, this is where you can actually get all the functions that are needed. When we're talking before about the data access, you can see here, as I was saying, from SQL Server, from Access, from an Access database, from analysis services. You can get data from the Windows Azure Marketplace, from the OData data feeds, and there's many other sources. Essentially, you can read from Oracle, Sybase, Informix. You can read from spreadsheets and text files and reports, SSRS reports as well. So there's and then sort of most of the ODBC connections. So what I will start with is my lesser favorite option, going through SQL. So if we go through SQL and basically, let's say we'll just connect to my demo database here, you can go and say I want to go and connect, and you will see here I think the reason I prefer the OData for those that have that option is that you will get now all the tables in the database. You will get a lot of data, a lot of tables here. So let's say if I just want to do, I guess, my customer, there you go. So if I want to select customer, you can actually come in here and say I want to call this, you can give it a friendly name. If you wanted to, you could actually go and select which columns you want to bring over. So the system will bring over by default everything. You can actually control which columns. So for instance, I just maybe want the customer number and the name, the address, the address, the city. Okay, so let's just bring those over. Then once we see finish, we'll go with, and we'll read the 68 customers that I got there. And then basically this is it. I mean, it just brings it into here. So that's one way you can read the data. Also, I mean, if you go SQL, as you noticed at the beginning, and this is what I was saying before, you can also go in here. Whoops, let me select the database. So tables of views, I mean, if you had any views specifically that would maybe make it friendlier for users, they would be listed here. Also, you can actually go the other route where basically you can sort of write your own SQL query. If either, if you are basically able to do that kind of SQL coding, or I mean, otherwise the other way. I mean, simply maybe one of your IT people could develop a query that you could just cut and paste. I mean, essentially for you, once you get the data into PowerPivot, you don't really care how it's being delivered to you. It's a very small step of just bringing the data here. Anyway, so I mean, this is the SQL way. Now I'll start again, and I will use the OData. So OData is a web service, which basically means that the data is being made available via the web, as a web service. So it could be accessed over the internet as well. And normally, at least on the NAV side, basically there's an actual HTTP address that you can go to. So if I want to read this, I can say from OData feed. I'm just going to say here, this is the address where I want to go. And as you can see here, this is a lot nicer and cleaner. So what I had done in a vision is I had created these three different SQL queries that are reading certain tables and certain fields from them. So essentially by doing this, I can actually sort of control what tables and what fields the business users have access to consume for their reporting. So here I can just go in here and just basically do this. Now, I will explain later why I'd rather have small names here, shorter names than what's there, even though this is pretty nice. I'll just call it SIL, and salespeople I'll just call SP. For now, for the purposes of our first demo, we're just going to bring actually just the sales invoice line. So we're just going to bring this over. So once I bring this in, it will bring over all the sales invoice lines that I had. Essentially, this is just a listing of the customers that I sold something to. This is the invoice number, and basically some of them are resources, some of them are items, quantity, price, cost, total dollars, and when it was actually done. As you can see, this is a lot easier and to sort of determine, and also it comes predetermined with the columns that you need versus all the columns. I mean, the table is much bigger; it has a lot more columns. Also, another advantage with OData is basically that obviously if you're accessing the SQL tables and if you're going straight to SQL tables, you will have to create your own sort of security environment, because basically, there you will have to give permissions to the user specifically to the tables that they want to access, since they're accessing directly SQL, so therefore not going through the Dynamics sort of security model, permission model that is being set up. OData, on the other hand, whether it's in NAV or AX or CRM, it's part of the business application level of the product, and therefore it will basically use the exact same security as the user has when they log into the application normally. So I mean, that's yet another advantage with this. So anyway, now going back here, as you notice here, these are the columns. When you bring the data, there you go. I was pressing delete. You cannot clear, you cannot modify or anything. You can basically either sort of include you cannot sort of write back to the database. This is meant simply for consumption. So in terms of what we can do here, for instance, I guess I don't have any data in this column, so I can definitely take this column outside of my data modeling here. So now, for instance, one of the things that we can do is you can actually add extra information to this data set that you've been provided with. So, a simple thing that we'll put in place is basically I want, for instance, to say, right now, one second. Basically, right now, let's say I have my line amount, which tells me the extended amount for the line, but I do not actually know what my extended cost is. I simply only have a unit cost. So then what I can do in here, I can just go, and the moment I type in, I can say, I want to basically take my unit cost. And as you can see, it has IntelliSense in the design, so essentially it kind of fills in stuff for you as you go through it. So I just want to multiply with quantity. The moment you put that in, PowerPivot knows that we're working with the data set, and therefore here what we're doing is we're actually doing calculations for all the lines. So for instance, we can rename this to line cost. So basically, as you can see, automatically does the calculation all throughout all the lines, because everything here is meant to be for all the lines together. So, I mean, from here on, you can actually continue and you can sort of do more. Basically, you can actually go in here and say, okay, now, I want to take my line amount. Where's my line amount? Here. And then I want to take out the line cost. And basically, that's going to be our profit for each line. Profit. Okay, so once we've done this, essentially, we've just finished defining our data model. This is a very simple data model, and I wouldn't expect you to have just one table most of the time, but for the purposes of the first step, this probably it's easier. So the way, as I mentioned before, the way you can actually sort of take you can manipulate this data in terms of reporting, you have all these options. I think in 2010 you only get pivot table and pivot chart, but then you can sort of go with flat and pivot table and some other things here. So we'll just take it out to pivot table. So now once you do pivot table here, you get the regular pivot table environment. And now I can start, slicing and dicing my data. So I want to look my line amount, I want to see my line cost. I want to see my profit. So, this is kind of, one of the simplest uses of PowerPivot. Honestly, I think this is pretty cool. I think it's cool they have the ability to read the data and add the functions and everything else. But honestly, I'm pretty sure most people say, well, why bother? Because basically, this is, you could easily just read them into a spreadsheet and then do the same pivot table based on that spreadsheet. And for the most part, they would be right. Essentially, this is pretty much 5% of the application of PowerPivot. But, one thing to keep in mind, though, is the following. Here, when we are doing a refresh, this refresh does, it actually reads back into the data model what we have in this part. So it refreshes the data in the spreadsheet based on what's here. However, there's another refresh here. And basically, when I do a refresh over here, it actually goes and reads back from the database. So, versus doing something where you have a spreadsheet that then you have to go and read back. This kind of maintains and updates everything. But generally, yeah, if this is all we do, this is really not worth going into it. Sorry.
Hey, Christy, there are a couple questions coming in. I don't know if you want to maybe pause at this point.
Okay, yes.
But, so one came in, can you do complicated logic statements using the ifs?
Yeah, absolutely you can. So, you actually have a whole bunch of functions, and I will actually showcase a couple of them a little bit later. But, you actually have here a list of functions, some of them that are essentially, so for instance, for the specific of if, you actually have if error, if not, or. So, these are all the functions that you actually normally have in Excel, so you can use those. You got a switch, you got a true condition and everything else. So these are general, Excel functions that you can actually do, but then there's also functions that are specific to as I mentioned, DAX. So for instance, you have some functions that are called count A, count AX, average, average A, average AX. Trust me, this is what I mentioned. This is what I meant by, this can easily be an entire week of just if you were to go through each of them. So you can definitely do conditional. Now, also the other thing, and probably is going to become clear as we go to the other one. There's also two levels. There's manipulating the data, the data model here, but there's also creating sort of measures and measures that you can slice and dice your numbers by. So and I'll move on to that as the next step. Okay, so this is the first part, but as I said, this is really not that exciting. So the next thing that we're going to do is basically show how we can build a real data model into this. So for instance, what I want to do now is I want to bring over more data references. See, for instance, here I have my customer, but and I can analyze by my customer, but let's say I want to analyze by my salesperson, let's say I want to analyze it by my state. So if I go in here and I bring in the other two data feeds that I had, which was my customer and my salesperson. Customer, salespersons. And you'll see in a second what's in them. So basically now I have, if you notice down here, there's actually now 3 different tabs. So I have an SIL tab, which is my sales invoice line. I have a customer tab, and I have a salesperson tab. So on the salesperson, what I brought over is basically, salesperson identifier and name, and this is their commission percentage. Apparently, I don't have any dimensions for them, so I guess that's not really relevant in this case. Okay, on the customer side, basically all I'm bringing over on the customer is the customer number and the name. They got a global dimension 1. Apparently there's nothing here, so we can take this one out as well. By the way, this does not delete it back from the data feed itself. It's just basically from your data model. And also the assigned salesperson. Okay, and this is where the whole data model comes in. So for instance, if we were to look at it, then this, this is one way you can look at this data feeds that you have right now. So you have a diagram view. So as you can see right now, I have just 3 isolated data stores, okay? So these are the 3 things in here. I got my sales invoice line, the customer, and the salesperson. Okay, but I mean, obviously, we know that there are connections between them, and we know basically that this would be actually something useful to set up. So what I'm going to go back data view. So here on the design, one second, I want to change that column. Under design, you can actually create relationships between all these data feeds. So for instance, I can say from the sales invoice line, the sale to customer number from the sales invoice line is connected to the customer number. Okay. So see, this is called the lookup table. The customer is a lookup table for the sales invoice line. So that's one relationship that we have in place now. And here now you can see that the icon of the column changes a little bit because there's a relationship. And then also we have another relationship. The customer salesperson code has a lookup into the salesperson code here. So that's another connection right there. So now if we were to go back and take a look at our diagram view, basically there's a connection between them, and you see kind of the data flows, flows this way. The links flow this way, or the way you should think about it, the filters are going to flow this way. I mean, you can actually do the linking by sort of doing a drag. You can drag them and say where you want to link them this way, but I kind of prefer the manual method. But I mean, it depends on what you're familiar with. I mean, it could be easier to just drag them this way if that's what you prefer. But I mean, the point is that now what we have done is basically we have defined a data model and the connections between all these things. So okay, what does that buy us? So for instance, right now, if I wanted to do, I mean, at least in NAV, if I wanted to do an analysis by salesperson, because the salesperson was not here in this main sort of data feed in this particular table, then I would have actually had to modify. Normally in a Vision, I would have to modify add the salesperson code as well, and then I could basically sort of build some reports that way. However, here, if we go now, first of all, you notice in 2010 you have to do a refresh to basically read the data model changes. In 2013, automatically does that. Now, as you can notice here, we actually have three different sort of groups of data that we can manipulate. So first, we have this one over here that we built before, which basically comes here from the sales invoice line, and this is the line amount, line cost, and profit. And this is the sell to customer from the sales invoice line. If I take this one out, okay, now basically that's the total across the entire sales invoice line, which is, if you will, our fact table. But now, for instance, what I can do is I can bring over my customer number from here. And if I bring it in, I'm going to get the exact same results. And why? Because basically there's a connection, there's a relationship. PowerPivot knows that there's a relationship between sales invoice line and customer. So basically at this point, I can just sort of do the same analysis without necessarily using this one. It will give me the exact same results. Even nicer, for instance, what I can do is I can bring my county in here, which is, I guess, my state. So now basically I can actually analyze my sales by state, by customer, sales, cost, and profit, simply by just bringing information from the from the related tables. I mean, this actually allows you to basically do reporting by things that are not necessarily built into the original sort of fact table. And we can take this further. So now, basically, for instance, I can do actually, let's do it this way, just to show you. Also, the other cool thing is, don't forget, you're in Excel. So 2010 and 2013, they have this thing called slicers. I mean, this has got nothing to do with necessarily with PowerPivot, but it's an ability. Okay, so if I want to get all, and I wanted to say salesperson. Okay, so now I got my salesperson here as a slicer, if you will. So okay, if I click blank, these are my sales for that one. If I click PS, these are my sales for that salesperson. And if I click JR, these are my sales for that salesperson. Slicer is just a feature of pivot tables in 2010 and 2013, but I mean, it's definitely a nice sort of bonus that you get by basically working straight into Excel. You can do it like this. Also, I guess if you guys notice, there's there are other salespeople down here that are somewhat grayed out compared to the color over here. I don't know if that kind of translates in the presentation, but essentially the reason for this is basically because, you know, that's one of the cool things about the slicers is that basically these things over here, they do not have any data. So if I were to click on H, if I insisted to do that, you know, it would pop up with no data. So that's another nice feature with this. You know, I think, yeah, I mean, so this is the slicers, and I think this, you know, this allows us to basically combine the features of Excel as it is with the PowerPivot concept.
Hey, Cristian, can I jump in with a couple of questions
Sure.
that came in? So one is, can you define inner and outer joins, maybe briefly?
Well, it depends, I guess, at what level. So if you're bringing a particular data set, like say the sales invoice line, remember if you can put a SQL query as the data set that comes in, okay? What that means is that you can do whatever you want in there. I mean, it could be, you know, things inner, out of joins, whatever you want to do. And see, from a SQL perspective, it's basically, you know, that's not an issue, and it's actually not a problem. In terms of the way the relationships are built onto the, you know, the way the relationships are built here into PowerPivot, there's a sort of a concept of a lookup. So for instance here, I could actually say something like, it's not necessarily wrong. We know there's a relationship between the customer number and the sales invoice line, right? But then if you notice here, the moment I do this, I get actually a little information point, which says the relationship cannot be created in the requested direction. When you click create, the direction of the relationship will be reversed. So the point here is that basically the top part is the many and the bottom part is the, you know, one. You know, basically there's expected to have a relationship. If you look at the the diagram view here, the relationship here is one to many, one to many. So here you cannot necessarily build joins because it's not meant to be the same way as a SQL querying concept. This is meant to be a way to sort of apply filters. So essentially, when I'm selecting a salesperson code here, the value applies as a filter to all the records in the customer. So when I did that you know, this thing, when I do JR in here, what PowerPivot actually does is says, okay, JR here, basically there's a number of records, and that's why it needs to be one to many. You cannot have many to many between things like this. Then the PowerPivot will look through the customer and see what are the records that actually have JR as the salesperson. Then for each of those records, we'll actually go into here and look at all the records that basically have that customer that has JR as a salesperson. And then that gives you the data set from this fact table that you can actually then summarize to get those numbers. So yes, you have inner and outer joins in terms of what you bring into the data model, but then here there's a sort of a, you know, hierarchical concept. The other thing also is that what you want to do in terms of design, I mean, this is more probably an advanced topic than anything. This is built into memory. So I mean, and it's based on a concept where basically it's this new, I think it's called scalar model that comes in with SQL 2012. So essentially, it tries to store the unique values of every column. So it kind of stores and searches by column instead of by records, which is the usual way we're used to it. So what you want to do is you can have as many data sets. It's actually recommended. But the performance will be better, you know, if you have many data sets rather than one big data set. Because obviously one thing you could have done, you could have easily done a join query that would have brought all these three together. Just bring over the salesperson, bring over the, you know, the customer state and everything. You could have easily done a SQL query and get just one. But essentially that would have taken more memory and would have made it less performant, the PowerPivot design, than if you had three different things, because you have three different things and then it stores them differently. You know, it's a lot easier here for a column to just figure out the unique values here, and for the county, then basically have the county being replicated on all the lines here. So generally, I do not, you know, basically you try to sort of do it as denormalized as possible. Hopefully that kind of answers the question. Was there another question, Jason?
There was a follow-up just asking what the memory management scheme that you mentioned was.
Well, I mean, the engine behind the scenes is called Vertipack. I mean, it's just Vertipack or X Velocity. I mean, it's just the name that they call. I mean, it's not something that we have access to or anything. It's just simply just the technology behind the scenes that they develop for this. So, but honestly, I always mix it up. So I know it's either fixed velocity or VertiPack, or might be both or something. So just never really, it's not really relevant for us in terms of how, how that happens behind the scenes, basically.
Okay. We do have one other question about connecting to more than one company database for creating a consolidated report. That's the
yeah,
only
I think I've had that question before in other presentations. Essentially, that's one of those things where at least the OData. So, for instance, if you were to use OData in NAV, it's actually company specific. So yes, you could bring each company over as a different data feed, but then essentially what would happen is you would actually end up here with sort of 3 different groupings. So essentially you would have, Navision has in the demo Canada, Mexico, and US, right? So you could actually end up here with sales invoice line US, Mexico, and Canada. So that, depending on what your goal is in terms of reporting, that may or may not be acceptable. So the other way you could do it, obviously on the nav side, and probably on the X side as well, you could probably do it either through some SSRS, because you can actually consume those as well, or just pure SQL queries where you combine all those tables together if you need to have one big data set. So let's say if you was a GL and you want to have all the GL entries from all 3 companies or whatever, how many companies you have, I guess if they all needed to be into the same place, then you would probably have to do some kind of a SQL query that joins them together and then use that as the data set. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay.
And I also see there's is there a list of specific PowerPivot functions. The list is very long, and as I said, the easiest way to find it once you get into PowerPivot here, if you click on this, there's basically all the functions, and there's different categories. And there's a gradual level of how to learn about them. So you can sort of see them here. There's obviously on Microsoft website on the MSDN, obviously some help. I don't find it that helpful a lot of times. I think the way you get introduced to these things is as you run into things they don't know how to do, and you kind of try to think of the functions that basically are relevant to you, and then sort of start from there. One that you'll end up using a lot is actually calculate. There's also, for advanced functions, there's also another one called sum. Where is it? Sum. And there's also some X as well. And then there's filter-related functions. So there's filter-related functions that actually will become relevant as you go. So you got filtering that you're probably going to end up filtering filters that you're going to end up doing stuff with. And towards that, I guess to use a specific PowerPivot function, a rather simple one. For instance, one of the things that we have is sort of a potential information. We do have the commission percentage for each salesperson. However, that's on this table, and here, basically the sales amount is here. So what you can do here is to just show one of the DAX functions. You can actually use a function called related. So related says go and get a column from a related table to this particular one that you're into. So basically what I want to do is I want to get from the salesperson. So now you probably understand why I renamed my data feeds basically shorten names, because it makes it easier when you type. The intelligence is very good, but if you have really long names, it just takes a lot. Long names are good because people will understand what you're trying to do, but on the other hand, I guess I'm lazy, so for me it's easier this way because then I don't have to type as much to get what I need. So there you go. What we ended up doing now is we ended up bringing over the commission percentage. So this is commission percentage. By the way, I forget, I think in 2010, Office 2010, it doesn't allow you to do the percentage sign. You probably would have to put the text, but 2013 seems to be a little bit more forgiving about that. And now, basically, from here, you can just do a simple calculation and just go, okay, I want to take my line amount, all right, and then multiply it with commission percentage and divide it by 100. Okay, so commission amount. Okay, so that's basically my commission amount. So now, obviously, once I go here, what I can do now is I notice that I have my commission amount here, and I can drop it in, and now I also have, I also have the commission amount calculated, and it works just as fine with all the filters and everything else. So basically, I mean, that's one calculation that you can put in place. Since we're kind of running out of time, I want to show you at least a couple of other things quickly. First of all, one of the things I will not go into how it's done, but just so you kind of know that there is something out there. So essentially, this is all nice and dandy, but I mean, I think usually the first question I get from most people once you kind of get to this level is that basically, what about analyzing this stuff by, by date or something like this? So for instance, if I were to I do have a date. So if I were to bring my posting date, that's great. But the problem with this is, you get the granular level of the posting date. You don't get, I mean, people would like to be able to analyze by year, by month, by quarter. So, I mean, whichever way I'm doing this, if I want to do any filtering, basically I'm just going to have to, basically pick a date or otherwise manually select a lot of them. So the way to do this is basically you can build, and this is where I'm going to show you guys just sort of from a high level perspective, you can actually build a calendar for yourself. So here, for instance, is a calendar that I built, and I mean this actually goes very well, especially with people that have their own, sort of irregular calendar. If you start your fiscal year in a different month, or simply if you have like one of those 4-5 or 4-4-5 or something like this. But I mean, here as you can see, there's a way, basically I've created a spreadsheet for me, and then you can use it as a data source, and then basically this allows me the ability to report by quarter, by month. And essentially, if you want to see where you get to that, this is a spreadsheet that I've done based on it. So for instance, all of a sudden, what I can do is I can say, a sales year to date, sales last year to date. This is actually using PowerPivot functions, sales year on year, sales month to date, sales last year month to date. So basically, I mean, now I can actually, analyze, break it down by years here. I could bring in, from my calendar, I can bring in my quarter if I want. So then I have my quarters underneath. And this is all based because in my PowerPivot model, one of my data sources here, I have the same similar data sources, but I also have my calendar, which I basically brought it in. Remember, one of the data sources, and now you also get to see the interface in 2010. I brought in, as remember, one of the options is actually Excel file. So what I tend to do every time I do a report, I actually just have this, calendar spreadsheet, and I just bring it in into any report, and then there's a couple of setups they need to do, and then basically you can actually go and build, analysis like this with quarters and years and everything else. Further, another thing that you noticed, again, nothing necessarily specific to PowerPivot. However, a cool feature in my mind, you can actually set up KPIs. So basically, this is part of Excel, so you can set up a KPI. So here, for instance, I have my profit percentage. So you can define. I mean, you can go in different different breakouts. Depending, here's 5 breakouts, here's 3 breakouts. So you can say basically you can either build it relevant to another measure. So for instance, if you're probably doing year to date versus last year to date, maybe you would say the target measure is basically last year to date, or if you say absolute value, and then I can say here, hey, okay, anything between anything up to 0.4 is red, this is yellow, and this is green. So now you can see that I have this. You can actually say I want to see the value, or I only want to see the status for this. So I mean, this is just taking again advantage of a combination of PowerPivot along with the actual abilities of of Excel, generally speaking. And in terms quickly, let's see, 1 second, here. So I mean, in terms of just to get a little bit of a flavor of this, if we were taking a look at, say, sales year on year, I mean, you can see here, this is an actual function. So see, as I was telling you, you got calculate, and then you have a function that allows you to do data add. Again, I'm not trying to teach you, and I know it's fast and everything, but just so you kind of get a little bit of a feel about how the syntax would look. So this is sales last year to date. And so, for instance, sales year to date, it's simply, calculate. As I said, one of the functions that you're going to end up using a lot, and if there is one function that you want to learn, is calculate. So basically, you have calculate, and there's a lot of options here, and this is how I'm calculating based on my calendar. I'm calculating year to date. And then last year to date is a similar concept. Also, the other thing is, while for the demo, just wanted to throw one more thing at you guys. While for the demo, I just dropped in these things, line amount, line cost, and just, the system automatically creates sort of a measure on the fly. One thing I recommend is building your own, and you'll see for a second why. So the other way I can actually, instead of line amount, I can say I want to call a measure sales, right? Which essentially is going to be the same thing. And I'm going to use that function sum, which I told you you might end up using a lot. So basically from sales invoice line, I want to get my line amount, okay? Now, in theory, this is going to give us the exact same numbers as this one. But one, this allows you to call it whatever you want. Two, it actually allows you to format it. So for instance, what I can do is I can say it's currency. So if I drop this in, it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same number as this. However, now one, this is formatted. Also, what this allows you is to use it in other functions afterwards. So my recommendation is, I mean, if you're just trying to do something quick just to see what happens, just drop them in here. Don't worry about the measures. But if you're trying to do a real-life environment with real-life reports, then you should use some, okay? Because then that allows you to do formatting. You also, basically, you should think of these as building blocks. I mean, if I'm trying right now to, if I'm trying to basically go and, if I'm trying to build my profit, I could also do it this way. So, I mean, I can sort of do cost, as another measure. So, SIL, SIL line cost. So that's my cost, and same thing, it's currency. Okay, and then, my point about building blocks, I mean, we already kind of have this, but my point is that now what I can do in here, I can say is profit 2 is actually sales minus cost. So one, this illustrates the building block concept, but also the other thing is to keep in mind is like if you change your mind as what cost could be, and maybe you want to throw a percentage on top of it or something like this, you can just go and edit the cost, and say, hey, my cost is actually that multiplied with 1.25, right? So basically, if I do that, now all of a sudden, not only does my cost change, but now my profit calculation changes as well, because basically I've just built it on top of these two. So I mean, this is just a good practice. So I mean, I think if you wanted to try, to get started, sum is one function, and then calculate, and basically after that, just sort of work your way up. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of features there. With that being said, let me just go back to the slides. I think we're kind of done. 1 second. So basically what we've done is we've done our first PowerPivot where we just brought in the sales invoice line. Then, we built a PowerPivot data model where we essentially just brought stuff over, like the customer and the salesperson. And then I did a couple of advanced design examples. And basically one last thing that I wanted to say before we open up for questions. Is this it? No, there's actually more to it. So basically, aside from PowerPivot, you actually have PowerView, PowerMap, Power Query, which all together with PowerPivot, basically they're branded by Power BI, as Power BI, and there is basically available with a lot more features where you actually can get websites integrated with SharePoint and everything else in Office 365. It's sort of still in the beta version. So I mean, you have here on the blogs they've announced this at World Partner Conference, and it's in beta version. So Power Query allows customers to easily search and access public data. Power Map is a 3D visualization tool. It's actually pretty cool. It allows you to do, I think I had a link, but I lost it. So it allows you to visualization PowerPivot we discussed about, and PowerView allows you to build sort of dashboards and really fancy-looking, visual reports, similar to what you're probably used to seeing in sort of third-party products, basically in terms of, putting it on top of it more than just pivot charts and everything else. So, I mean, while I think these are obviously in beta version, some of them, Power Query, Power Map are definitely new. PowerView has been around for a while. And then you can get here Power BI sites, and they're basically part of the SharePoint. And then there's this new natural language query, which I think it's definitely still just in beta mode. But I mean, obviously Microsoft is investing a lot in this. So, I mean, essentially, you guys starting with this will actually allow you to be on a path of something that will get stronger and stronger. I don't think right now, I always say this PowerPivot, the PowerPivot has some limitations. And definitely, I'm not sitting here and saying, hey, this is as good as, or anywhere as good as a full-blown BI. But I mean, its limitations are basically just a limitation of its age. PowerPivot has been around since Office 2010, and I think it's been like 2-3 years. And I think Microsoft has focused on this a lot more only very recently. Before, I mean, originally PowerPivot, when it came out for Office 2010, you would download it from a separate website from Microsoft. I mean, it was literally just sort of like a side project at the time. But I mean, now obviously Microsoft has realized what this can be and what they can do with it and everything else, and it's part of the product. With that being said, going back to the conference, 1 second. Basically, I guess at this point, if you guys will open up to questions, if you guys have still questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is there, or you can always, find my website, dynamicsbiguy.com. If any of you guys want the slides, definitely email me. I can also send you, if you'd like, this spreadsheet, which has some of the functions that could maybe give you a little bit of, starting point, as well as this calendar. And I mean, I don't know, I think I noticed there's a bunch of questions, so maybe we should start on those.
Yeah,
Jason,
a bunch of questions are coming in here in the Q&A area, which is great to see. I see a few. And if you're going to send something in the chat, please make sure it goes to all panelists so that Christy can see it as well. But let's get to a couple of them. So maybe a couple here that back up to what you were just talking about. So one is the question about using a different financial calendar than what you were showing. What about if you have a different financial calendar?
Well, I mean, basically here, see there's this date key that allows you to basically the relationship. But I mean, this calendar, I mean, essentially you can make it up whatever you want it to be. So I mean, it doesn't have to be. I mean, here what I've ended up doing is just the regular calendar the way we know it. But I mean, you can basically make if you define the month October to be here, basically to be from from 09:15 to 10:15, that will be what PowerPivot will take as October. So I mean, this is just the spreadsheet that you can build for yourself. And I mean, you can make whatever you want from the calendar. I mean, you can change, you can change the days of the week if you'd like, or you can sort of do the sorting, see day and week. You can start with Sunday if that's what makes sense for you. So I mean, that's exactly the point. It allows you to build your own calendar.
Mm-hmm. Someone else had a suggestion that they wrote in. Peter says, I believe Power Query would help consolidate data from different company databases. What do you think about that?
Yes, though I mean the demo, and I haven't played with it, I have to admit. So I mean I can't really answer. But I mean in the demo that I've seen from them, I think what they want to do, the example was really towards getting data. I think either from Facebook or from somewhere else. I mean I think they're looking at Power Query especially to try to get more unorganized data. Essentially, I guess I hate the term, big data, but I mean, I think essentially that's where they're trying to sort of use that. So, it's very easy to control stuff that's within your organization, and it's nicely structured, especially when it comes from a ERP product. But I mean, it's a little bit tougher when you're looking at data from the outside. So I think they use this kind of examples where basically they just sort of use something from the outside, just generically available. Oh yeah, there was a data feed that they had from, I think, like what were the data centers on the demo of the WPC? What were the data centers that for Microsoft? Where are they? And then there's some information about what each data center did. So that's what they use Power Query for.
We have a question here. Can you describe the pros and cons of this approach versus using SSAS cubes?
Okay. Well, I mean, we kind of covered that at the beginning. So essentially, the difference between this and SSAS cubes, I mean, there's pros and cons. I mean, the pro basically is that you can get started. I mean, you saw what I did here. I mean, basically, you can get started in 5 minutes, and you don't necessarily need, as long as you have access to the data, you don't need a BI developer to basically be able to do something, and building anything in terms of OLAP cubes requires basically both SQL knowledge as well as MDX knowledge, or at least the OLAP cube development from the Business Intelligence Development Studio. So basically anything that you're trying to do, you have to go through. Remember, there's a whole framework when it comes to cubes, which is basically you have to have staging database, you have a data warehouse, you have to have the cubes, and you have to carry the data through all of those. Whereas here, you just bring it in, and you quickly can do it, one, without necessarily having to go through all those steps, and two, this is something that I do believe that business users can understand how to do. Whereas basically, unless you're a programmer, you cannot, most of the time, you cannot really make any changes to the cubes. So that's one of the advantages. Basically, it just allows people to build their own reports without necessarily having to go to IT to request certain specifications and wait for them to be done. Also, I mean, this can also, I mean, as a con, obviously, it cannot handle as much data. I don't want to say, I mean, I think in terms of functionality and measures and everything else, and in terms of the ability of slicing and dicing, cubes definitely allow you more options than PowerPivot. But I mean, I do think for a large population, basically, this could be good enough, or at least, if nothing else, this is a good starting point. And at some point, when you hit the wall, in terms of either data amount or performance or functionality that cannot be PowerPivot, by sort of understanding this, I think it would be easier to try to sort of transition into BI because you kind of understand the concepts already.
All right, we have a question here, actually two questions that are related. In your experience, what's the best strategy to handle customer expectations around Excel and the fact that data can be quote-unquote manipulated? And maybe as a related question, best practices for handling security.
All right, so we'll start with the security then, I guess. I kind of touched on that with your data and SQL. So, I mean, essentially, the advantage, if you're doing SQL and you're giving someone access, and that's why I like OData, and probably that's why Microsoft is pushing it so much, is that if you did SQL, they would have access to the entire table, but it's still controlled by you. I mean, essentially, you would control who has access to what data in terms of tables. With OData, you can actually control it to the level of which fields. So, I mean, to a salesperson, you could pass along the information, basically of the sales information without passing along the cost information, and you could probably filter it down by only their own customers or their own invoices or something like this. So, I mean, it's essentially the security part. Remember, that was the part of the slogan, managed by IT. The security part is handled on the, data source side. But, the advantage here is that basically, once you define it once, you could have all your business users out there, as long as they have access to this, they can consume that, and basically they're limited to whatever you give them access. So you could have a central person simply concerning themselves with only what should or should you not have access to, and then you don't necessarily, because usually what happens today we design Dynamics reports, or we design or cubes for that matter, you have a combination. IT also needs to sort of understand the business requirements and pass them along to the consultants or to the BI developers and everything else. Whereas here, all you have to do is just worry about who has access to what, and then the rest of it, the business users can do on their own. And, and I think that kind of maybe that ties into the other one in terms of customer expectations. I mean, to me, I think the idea is, basically customers should be, if you're doing the personal BI thing where you're just playing with it on your Excel spreadsheets on your end, I mean, essentially whatever you want to get out of it, you will get out of it. As much time as you put into it, trying to figure out. And I mean, I think one of the advantages of this allows you to actually play with things. I mean, if you were to do, if you were to do the cubes, if you were thought that maybe a certain measure or a certain way of analyzing things might be beneficial to the business, but you don't know, it would cost you money to try that out and figure out whether you're right or not. Here, it would just cost you some time on trying something quickly, assuming that it's possible through PowerPivot, and you could do a prototyping and figure out whether that's a useful measure or not. And if it's not, you could just drop it. In terms of being manipulated, I mean, again, as I said, it doesn't change the original data source. Yes, can they change? Can they change the data brought into the spreadsheet? Sure, but I mean, that's just a spreadsheet. If you worry a little bit about that control, and you don't want people to actually modify what's within the PowerPivot data model, that's when you sort of move up to the, to sort of the corporate side of it, which is, making these available through SharePoint. SharePoint will allow you to give them access to them with or without the ability of editing, as far as I know. Also, the other cool thing about this is that if you go to SharePoint, basically, you can actually schedule the refresh of the data, because, one of the things, I guess, depending on how wide this becomes, the use becomes in your organization, you could have an interesting situation where, you may have, 10 users all basically building reports based on sales. When they hit the refresh on the data model, they would all be reading probably the same sales data. So, obviously, if you really want to scale out, you might want to do SharePoint, because then you could use, you could set up the data model, and you could do the refresh at night, and basically not have everybody do it throughout the day. Depending on how much data they're reading, they could actually slow down your system. Okay. Do we have anything else?
There's a question about 32 or 64-bit versions of Excel for PowerPivot, and well, this person, I don't know if you saw this one. This person just wrote that I installed the 32-bit version. I've been bringing in item ledger entries with about 300,000 rows, and it's indicating that there's not enough memory and that I should consider a 64-bit version. I guess they may be answering their own question there, but how limited in your experience is the 32-bit version?
Well, I mean, remember what I said before. It's you can have as many tabs, if you will, or as many tables, in there. The biggest issue that is going to eat up memory is essentially having many columns into one table, because each column has to be stored on its own. And I mean, there's a longer conversation as to how that works and everything. So, I mean, it really, I mean, I guess The 32-bit is okay, and I've been able to do that, but you basically have to be very stingy in terms of what you're bringing over. You should only bring over the data that actually, the data that is actually relevant. So, I mean, you saw in my case, I brought in like the global dimension 2, which seemed to be, which seemed to not have any data in it. So basically, there's no reason to have that column in there. Or if you have a column, for instance, that maybe ends up being the same value across most of the columns, then you either, then you have to take it out. So, I mean, there are ways, there are ways of handling. The less columns you have, the more records you're going to be able to fit in the same amount of memory, right? So, I mean, 64-bit allows you the luxury of being a little bit less, I guess, careful about it, but versus 32-bit. And I mean, I don't necessarily know that there's a formula. Essentially, Excel is either going to tell you, yes, I can handle it, or no, I cannot. Now, it depends also on how much RAM you have, on your laptop. On your computer they're using, sorry. I mean, my laptop has 16 gig of RAM, but I mean, basically, I'm pretty sure most people don't have that. So basically, I mean, it also depends on that. I mean, that's why maybe, I would recommend that you probably sort of use a separate server just for this, or like use one of the servers instead of someone else's computer and just have everybody go and connect from there. Maybe this way you can install 64-bit just there, so people don't have, any. I still don't know what the possible conflicts are. I still don't. Nobody ever said, I've never seen anybody say exactly what it is. So, and then that's easier. You can put more memory in only one place, and you can install the 64-bit and everything.
There's one last question here. Can you consume web services from AX 2012 in PowerPivot for Excel 2010?
Consume web services from AX 2012.
In Excel
if it's old data, yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter which version it is, and yes, old data can be read in 2010 as well as 2013. Now, again, the old data web services are slightly different than web services, but I mean, the way I know it's done in AX is based on this query object that you set up. There's some queries, and then you publish them as old data web services, so they would work just as well in 2010.
All right. Well, we are well past the top of the hour here. I think we've made it through all the questions. Thanks everyone on the line for joining us today and for so many great questions for Christy. And Christy, thanks again for joining us again. I hope we can do this again soon.
No problem. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thanks, and have a good day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.